Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consulting here. I put up a post last night about the differences between carbohydrate and fat for fuel utilisation. So it always is a hot topic. It seems to be the topic that most people have the biggest opinions about in terms of should we go high fat, low carb, or low carb, high fat, what sort of diets we can use for endurance performance. There's some other things we can talk about, health benefits potentially, or differences in general well-being and all that, but I'm going to go purely performance-based today. And I just want to run you through the basics behind how we actually get energy from a carbohydrate, how we get it from a fat, and the variables which will affect which one we use more of, okay? So I'm going to jump over to the computer first because it's something I want to show you quickly, and then we're going to come back and see how the exercise intensity and our fitness level affects which one we use. So this is from an article which I wrote up, which is on the metsperformance.com/blog website here. So you're welcome to have a look. It is about halfway down. Endurance sports nutrition, high or fat diet, high carb or high fat diet's better. Okay, delving into the science. So this was all based around the scientific literature which we have found so far. And there's just, this part here is just what I want to quickly take you over, all right? So at the top here, we have the source of energy. If anybody wants me to link where I got this information from, I can. I can guarantee you it was a scientific literature journal review, but if you do want to be specific, let me know, I'll post it in the comments. But we've got carbohydrate here and fat below, okay? From a carbohydrate, we get 4.1 calories per gram of energy, and for fat, we get 9.3, so we get quite a lot more for fat. The oxygen required, however, for a carbohydrate is only 0.81 mils per gram that it uses up, whereas for a fat, it's 1.96 mils of oxygen per gram. So if you do the math there, it actually takes 2.4 times more oxygen to metabolize a fat than it does a carbohydrate. If it takes 2.4 times more oxygen, it's going to take 2.4 times longer as well, or close enough to. When we use carbohydrate, we use 0.81 mils of oxygen to metabolize it, and we also expel the identical amount of carbon dioxide. Okay, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio here. With fat, we only produce 1.39 grams of carbohydrate. Sorry, 1.39 mils of carbohydrate per gram, which works out to be your RER value here. So what your RER is, it's respiratory exchange ratio. Sorry, a bit of a tongue twister. So this is a number between 0.7 and 1, which indicates the predominance of each fuel. Okay, so the way we do it is by we measure how much oxygen we're breathing in, how much carbon dioxide we are breathing back out, and based on that, we can figure out the proportion of carbohydrate being used for fuel and the proportion of fat being used for fuel. Okay, so the way we do it is we take the carbon dioxide expelled, divided that by the VO2 taken in, so carbon dioxide out divided by oxygen consumption in, and it gives us a number between 0.7 and 1. If we get 0.7, that means we're using 100% fat. If you do the math here, 1.96 in, 1.39 out, I will just double check that is right. 1.96 divided by 1.39. Sorry, other way around, 1.39 divided by 1.96. Yep, there we go, 0.709. So it might be a couple of decimal points out, but yeah, 0.7. Okay. If we get an RER of 1, and it can actually go a little bit above 1 if we have lactate or lactic acid in the system, but keep it simple. If it's at 1, it means we're using 100% carbohydrates. So we're using 0.81 oxygen in, 0.81 carbon dioxide out, so we're at that RER of 1. So when we get an RER of 0.85, or splitting the difference between 0.7 and 1.0, we're getting that crossover point, which is 50% of our energy coming from carbohydrates and 50% coming from fat, which is what we see below here, okay? And again, the way that we determine our RER, or whether we use fat or carbohydrates, is purely based on exercise intensity, okay? So at 100% VO2 max, or at threshold, so threshold is the max intensity you can hold for 45 to 60 minutes. That could be anywhere from sort of 70% up to 94% if you're really, really advanced and elite there. The elite guys hold about 94%. You're going to be burning 100% carbohydrates here, okay, which we can see. Intensity at the bottom here is a percentage of VO2 max. This, again, this isn't the best graph because it doesn't take into account threshold, but it's really hard to, in terms of teaching and showing it on a graph, it's really hard to put the threshold in there as well. But we see as at rest, we're using predominantly fat and very little carbohydrate. As we increase to a point of 65% VO2 max, we're getting to that crossover point where that's 50-50, all right? The reason it's 50-50 is because we know that, so exercise intensity, it's still sub-maximal. We're working moderately hard, 65%, it's moderately hard. That's sort of where a lot of guys would sort of complete an Ironman distance in. But our oxygen supply is good, and our oxygen demand or our energy demand is still sub-maximal. It's not quite at its peak yet. So we can still take that extra 2.4 times oxygen and still get quite a lot of fat at 65% of our VO2 max. We'll still get a lot of energy from fat at 65% of our VO2 max. Okay. Now, as the intensity increases even more, we get close to this 100% VO2 max or approaching threshold. What we see is we're getting 100% of our energy from carbohydrates alone and 0% from fat. And the reason that is because now our exercise intensity is maximal. It's right at the top. So our oxygen demand is maximal. Our oxygen supply can just meet that, only just. But because carbohydrates take 2.4 times less oxygen to metabolize, and therefore they're 2.4 times quicker to metabolize, the body's just going to use carbohydrates. It's not going to say, all right, we've got, we're at a maximal effort, but let's take 2.4 times more oxygen or 2.4 times more time to start using fat. It just can't do it. All right. The only way we can burn more fat is if we increase our VO2 max, and that 65% of VO2 max occurs later on. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. It's all to do with oxygen cost. When the exercise intensity is low or sub-maximal, we can use quite a bit of fat because we have more time to use it because we've got more oxygen. But when that oxygen demand is maximal or really high near threshold, we don't have that time anymore. Carbohydrates are simpler to break down, so we're going to use 100% carbohydrates. I'm going to jump back up on the board and show you a few things. So with that being said, guys, let's take two examples, all right? Two athletes, let's say they have identical thresholds, okay? So they're going to start burning, they're going to hit that crossover point at the same point and hit 100% of carbohydrate utilization at the same point. We'll say they're at the same threshold just for the sake of understanding the theory that we're going through here. We've got fat utilization on this column here on the left, carbohydrate utilization on the right, and exercise intensity at the bottom. So 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Apologies for the handwriting. Same here, different athletes, same intensities. 40, 60, 80, 100. Bit wonky, that's all right. So it's the same looking graph. Let's say that this athlete on the left, or maybe pre-training athlete, they have a VO2 max of 50 mils per kilo per minute, all right? We do some training, we get an increased VO2 max, and now we have 60 mils per kilo per minute, okay? Now this 65% VO2 max at that crossover point, it's not always going to be 65% VO2 max because remember it comes down to where our threshold is as well. But it doesn't change the amount of oxygen that we're using, okay? So all this talk about becoming metabolically efficient, the only way we can do it is by either improving our threshold or by improving our VO2 max, or actually becoming more economical with our movement, all right? So at the start, we know that the curve looks, a fat curve looks something like this. Low intensity, high fat. Opposite for carbohydrates. Go up here, and that's at a roughly 65%. Again, we've got this person over here who has the same looking curve, they've got the same threshold as well. That was a terrible line. Apologies for that. Pretend that it looks the same. Okay, let's say this is 65% as well. Now, if this person, let's say it's 65% at a VO2 max of 50, we're cycling at 200 watts. Okay, so at 200 watts prior to training, we are hitting
50-50 carbs and fats at 200 watts. Right, 200 watts. That occurs at 65% of our VO2 max. Now, if we improve our VO2 max from 50 up to 60, 65% of 60 is higher than 65% of 50. So our crossover point actually happens later on. So it actually happens, the crossover point might be at, say, 225 watts now, because our VO2 max is now bigger. What that means is that instead of, if we got fitter and then we go back and cycle at 200 watts on 60 VO2 max, that's not 50-50 anymore. That's even more sub-maximal. So this is coming across closer to here. I'll do a different colour. Let's say it'd be somewhere around here. All right, so this is 200 watts. What we can see is that we're still burning more fat at this point because we're not working as hard. We have more oxygen available. So at the same absolute workload, so at 200 watts pre and after training, we can burn more fat and less carbohydrates because we have a bigger aerobic engine, a bigger aerobic capacity. So our body can actually go, yeah, we do have 2.4 times longer and more time and more oxygen to go and send to metabolize fats. The crossover point still happens at 65%, but 65% of 60 mils is better, or a higher absolute number, say 225 watts, than 65% of 50, okay? So by improving your aerobic engine, or improving your VO2 max, you can actually burn more fat at the same absolute workload, so at 200 watts. Relative terms, it doesn't change, it's still 65%. The other way is with threshold, because as I said, threshold is average person 70%, elite guys are 88 to 94%. So if we can change our threshold as well, because the way with threshold we're producing lactic acid, and lactic acid, or the lactate part of that, releases carbon dioxide too. I'm not going to go into detail with that, but basically if we can tolerate and clear out lactic acid better, we can actually produce less carbon dioxide and therefore bring that respiratory exchange ratio down a bit as well. But bottom line, what I'm trying to say is that it's not to do with the fuel that we're getting used to. If we starve ourselves of carbohydrates, all that's going to do is reduce the intensity. Okay. Well, I think what people get mixed up with is that if we do long slow distance training, okay, so from everybody I've spoken to who does low carb high fat for athletes, they still cycle in carbohydrates. There's not no carbohydrates whatsoever. So what they do is they cycle it in for the higher intensity stuff. They cycle it in for the higher intensity stuff because we know we can only use carbohydrates. The point is we don't need to reduce the amount that we take in. A balanced diet is the best thing that we can do, okay? We don't need to get rid of our carbohydrates so then for our long slow distance rides, it's not all runs or cycles or whatever it is, it doesn't make a difference. All we need to do is stick to the heart rate zone where we're not producing lactic acid. If we're not producing lactic acid, go back and have a look at the VO2 max video. We stimulate those mitochondria, we then improve our VO2 max so our aerobic capacity increases. It's just extra work for no more benefit. Just stick to the zone where you're not producing lactic acid and you'll get the benefit. A lot of people they send me videos about that FASTER study. I can't remember what it stands for, but they put through 20 endurance athletes, ultra runners through. One group had 20 plus months experience at a keto diet or a ketosis diet, so that just means that we're essentially limiting carbohydrates to an absolute minimum, very, very little. I think there was 10% coming from carbohydrates, 70% from fat, and 20% from protein. Okay, so very little carbohydrates. The theory behind it was that we get this ketosis or these ketones, and what they can be used as is an alternative source of glycogen, okay, or of glucose, which would then be a carbohydrate. Now, it doesn't quite work like that. Like in terms of, it still comes down to oxygen consumption and how much oxygen we have available to use a fat. It's just, fat is more dense, it takes a lot longer. What that study did, which completely turned me off at all, it lost all its credibility, was because before they did a 3-hour run on the treadmill at 64% VO2 max. Immediately before they did that run, they gave the high carb, low fat group a sugary drink, 380 calories of high glucose or high carbohydrate drink, compared to a low carbohydrate drink to the high fat, low carb. Get mixed up here. Okay. So what they did, they just introduced all this carbohydrate into the system, Now, it's not carbohydrate which inhibits fat burning, because they ended up finding out that, you know, the ultra runners who had the low carb, high fat ended up burning a lot more fat, and they did. But the reason that was the case is because they've just spiked the other group's insulin levels. Now, we already know that insulin inhibits fat burning. What insulin is, when we take in carbohydrates, the insulin is released in the bloodstream, it binds to the carbohydrate and stores it as glycogen, so we can then use it later on. Now, there's heaps of research. We already know that insulin inhibits fat burning, okay? It's not the carbohydrate that inhibits fat burning or the presence of carbohydrate, it's that insulin. So that's why I say to guys, all my athletes will know that eat those carbohydrates in the days leading up and the morning of a race, but with that last hour window, don't have too many high GI carbohydrates, because then we're going to release that insulin, which is going to inhibit your fat burning. I tell them not to eat carbohydrates until an hour into the event. So then we can maximize our fat burning capacity at the start, but then afterwards, we need to replenish our carbohydrates, or we're going to hit the wall. If we hit the wall and run out of carbohydrates, we don't even have this 50-50 anymore. We have to go all the way down to like 25, 30. We've got nothing left. We're going at a very, very slow crawl, essentially, because we've got no carbohydrates to use. So I say don't eat them for the first hour, and then after that, you just need to keep consuming it. Every 20 to 30 minutes, just keep those gels in, bananas, whatever you can do. The insulin's going to rise and our fat burning is going to decrease, but the alternative is that we run out of carbohydrates, which is going to reduce that exercise intensity. So long story short, a lot of information there. I might write up a quick summary as well. But it's not the presence of carbohydrate which inhibits fat burning, it is the presence of insulin. So you just need to control that insulin in your race to then maximise your fat burning capacity while still using those carbohydrates. And if you want to burn more fat at the same workload, increase your VO2 max. Do that training to get there. Any questions, put them below. I'm sure this will spark a bit of controversy and discussion. So chuck it down and let's have a good discussion about it. Thanks, guys.